throat with a flick of his wrist, how to uncurl smoke from his fingers and send it slithering into the distance. He'd once loved stomping through these wilds, challenging trees to duel, digging for treasures he'd buried himself. Each caper had exposed a new challenge, a new beast, a new agony to conquer. The trek was now nothing more than an essential commute, and nothing short of devastating. Life, he feared, would never be the same. His heart thundered harder as he approached the mouth of an obsolete train tunnel, its crumbling interior choked by a tapestry of climbing vines, the scent of life so fragrant it chafed the mind. Blue-winged birds and shafts of brilliant sun stole through fissures in the rotted structure, drowsy blooms unfurling in this gloss of light, dust motes suspended and glittering. The tunnel was a portal to another world, one in which, once upon a time, he'd intended to live forever. A green locust latched onto the young man's shoulder as he entered the underpass, the contrast of bright on black, like a shriek in the void. Cyrus pulled his cape more tightly about his body as he moved, something akin to grief webbing between his ribs. In the narrowing distance, the sight of so much green spiraled into a blitz of white. A thicket of waist-high clouds rose up from the ground, and he traversed this odd stretch with care, for the experience was not unlike wading through frost. It was just as his legs began to freeze that the cloud path thinned beneath his feet, and Cyrus suppressed a shiver. A palpable veil of magic hung always above the many acres encircling the diviner's quarters in Tulan, shrouding the central temple and its many outbuildings. There were few indeed who knew the old train tunnel ran perpendicular to this ancient site, and fewer still who were granted permission to enter from this path. The Tulanian prince had been 3 years old the first time he'd visited these hallowed grounds. From birth, he'd been a frustrated child. He'd cried easily, screamed freely, and though he knew himself capable of speech, he'd been uninterested in the performance. The day his nursemaid had lovingly stroked his head and said he was quite beautiful for an idiot, the child had thrown a wooden block at her face. Only when the woman responded in fury did Cyrus remember that violence was frowned upon, and as she rounded on him, he'd bolted for an open window, registering the nanny's horrified shriek only as he tumbled out the other side like a potato. He'd bounced 3 times off the hip of the fatally steep roof before plummeting to the ground, where he'd landed with a final, unexpected bounce. The boy had badly scraped his hands and knees. A bruise blossomed along the back of one arm and part of his cheek. Still, he'd not cried. Like a fern uncurling, Cyrus had risen slowly and with surprise, pushing copper locks out of his face with small, dirty hands, only to discover himself at the center of a halo. Never before had he seen diviners up close. They'd stared down at him, faces obscured, black cloaks so dark they seemed to leave holes in the world. "There you are, little one," he'd heard someone say. The child had rubbed his head in wonder, marveling that they'd managed to put the voice inside his mind. It was only then that Cyrus laughed, that he spoke aloud his first words with delight. "That was magic," he'd said. The nanny was still screaming as she ran out into the gardens, half the palace staff at her heels, all wild with hysteria.